Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. Today I will present various perspectives on power, primarily, but not entirely, from a sociological perspective. I will contrast those positions and then express my own views on why one perspective perhaps is better than the others, or perhaps a combination of perspectives. I will begin by talking about the concept of power elites. The notion of a power elite in sociology goes back primarily to C.Wright Mills, the late C.Wright Mills. He was a professor at Columbia University. He was born in 1916, died at a relatively young age in 1962. His view of power elites in sociology is considerably different from how people on the libertarian right, particularly in the United States, Australia, use the word elites and talk about the elites. It is even different from how people, say, in the Occupy movement, talk about the elites or the 1%. Power elite was used in a very discreet, very careful, and specific fashion by C.Wright Mills. He was not a conspiracist, at least not completely a conspiracist. Although I am skeptical of the concept, I personally do not find the notion of power elite to be a particularly useful one. It is an important concept in sociology, and so I feel like I should at least begin by addressing it. So I will read what Mills said about power elite. This is from his book, which is called, appropriately enough, The Power Elite, which was written back in the early 1960s. This is from the 2000 edition. The power elite is composed of men whose positions enable them to transcend the ordinary environments of ordinary men and women. They are in positions to make decisions having major consequences. Whether they do or do not make such decisions is less important than the fact that they do occupy such pivotal positions. Their failure to act, their failure to make decisions, is itself an act that is often of greater importance than the decisions they do make, for they are in command of the major hierarchies and organizations of modern society. They rule the big corporations, they run the machinery of the state, and claim its prerogatives. They direct the military establishment. They occupy the strategic command posts of the social structure, in which are now centered the effective means of the power and the wealth and the celebrity which they enjoy. Such an elite may be conceived as omnipotent, and its powers thought of as a great hidden design. Internationally, the image of the omnipotent elite tends to prevail. All good events and pleasing happenings are quickly imputed by the opinion makers to the leaders of their own nation. All bad events and unpleasant experiences are imputed to the enemy abroad. Within each of the most powerful institutional orders of modern society, there is a gradation of power. To say that there are obvious gradations of power and of opportunities to decide within modern society is not to say that the powerful are united, for they fully know what they do, or that they are consciously joined in conspiracy. Such issues are best faced if we concern ourselves in the first instance more with the structural position of the high and mighty, and with the consequences of their decisions, than with the extent of their awareness or the purity of their motives. It is not my thesis that for all epochs of human history and in all nations, a creative minority, a ruling class, an omnipotent elite shape all historical events. The American elite is neither omnipotent nor impotent. The view that all of history is due to the conspiracy of an easily located set of villains or of heroes is also a hurried projection from the difficult effort to understand how shifts in the structure of society open opportunities to various elites, and how various elites take advantage or fail to take advantage of them. To accept either view of all history as conspiracy, or all of history as drift, is to relax the effort to understand the facts of power and the ways of the powerful. Class consciousness is not equally characteristic of all levels of American society. It is most apparent in the upper class. The conception of power elite, accordingly, does not rest upon the assumption that American history, since origins in World War II, must be understood as a secret plot or as a grand and coordinated conspiracy of the members of this elite. The conception rests upon quite impersonal grounds. The rise of the elite, as we have already made clear, was not and could not have been caused by a plot. There is a great difference, Richard Hofstadter has remarked, between locating conspiracies in history and saying that history is, in effect, a conspiracy. There is nothing hidden about it, although its activities are not publicized. As an elite, it is not organized, although its members often know each other, seem quite naturally to work together, and share many organizations in common. There is nothing conspiratorial about it, although its decisions are often publicly unknown, and its mode of operation manipulative rather than explicit. It is not that the elite believe in a compact elite behind the scenes and a mass down below. It is not put in that language. It is just that the people are of necessity confused and must, like trusting children, place all of the new world of foreign policy and strategy and executive action in the hands of experts. So, in his description of the power elite, he makes it very clear that he is not talking about a conspiracy. In that sense, his definition of elite is very different from the contemporary view, especially as it is championed by people like the American radio talk show host Alex Jones, who regularly talks about a conspiracy, or as another fellow who I occasionally listen to, named Cliff High, who has said that everything is a conspiracy. He argues that there are two ways of viewing life. One is seeing life as a succession of choices, and the other one is seeing everything as being manipulated or orchestrated from behind the scenes. I think that is completely absurd. So, if there is such an elite, and I'm not saying at this point whether I think there is or not, it is certainly not conspiratorial. On the other hand, as Mills notes, there are people who occupy certain elite statuses or higher income statuses or higher statuses of privilege or of opportunity or of prestige or of wealth who have access to more resources than the rest of us. And by virtue of that, they have, as Mills correctly says, more class consciousness. Now, to explain class consciousness was a concept originated by Karl Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels. What Marx basically said is that the capitalists, or the bourgeoisie is the French term for middle class, although in a 19th century European context, middle class is today what would be called old money. The middle class, or the bourgeoisie of 19th century Europe, according to Karl Marx, had a certain level of class consciousness, meaning they were acting in terms of what was beneficial to them. What is beneficial to a capitalist is to make money. What is beneficial to a capitalist is to pay workers as little as they can possibly get away with. And so Marx often compared the salaries or the wages of the working class to breadcrumbs thrown at pigeons. And I think that there is some validity to that as well. So the upper classes, to a degree, have class consciousness, whereas the lower classes generally do not. Marx was especially concerned with the working class, or what he called the proletariat, which is the working class. In the 19th century, what he meant were factory workers. If we move on through the 20th and then into the 21st century, the notion of working class can be expanded to include police officers, firefighters, construction workers, postal workers, and so forth. Basically, people who engage either in manual labor or in jobs which have that relative status, or in some cases in jobs or positions which have historically been identified with the working class, like police officers and firefighters. The working class in the United States are typically a very patriotic social class. If you look at the U.S. military is disproportionately populated by members of the working class, and there are several reasons for that. One, for example, is the patriotism of the working class. Another reason is that going into the military for working class people has traditionally been a way to get a good education. A person might ordinarily not be able to afford the cost of a college or perhaps a graduate school education, but in the military a person can do that with relatively little expense. So the working class, according to Marx, at least as he defined it in the 19th century, was a class without class consciousness. Instead, he argued that the working class had false consciousness. False consciousness can be compared to, say, if somebody steps on my foot and I say, "Thank you, please press harder." That's false consciousness. So for a member of the working class to have false consciousness is for that person to accept the class consciousness of the oppressor. So if a capitalist believes that capitalist ideology is good, that capitalist has class consciousness. But if a member of the working class believes that capitalism is good, that worker has false consciousness. So instead, what Marx was attempting to encourage workers to do was to develop their own class consciousness. Therefore, in his first major work, written in 1843, the Communist Manifesto, he made his famous statement, "Workers of the world, unite." And by uniting, what he was arguing is that workers need to give up, in effect, the chains of capitalism, to recognize that the capitalist ideology has not been of service to them, and that they must reject capitalism and accept the ideology of a socialist revolution, which, according to Marx, would eventually lead to communism, which would be a condition of society without government and without social class. So a society without any kind of vertical power arrangements, and a society without any social stratification or social inequality. Now, whether that type of communism is practical, I don't know. I am skeptical of it. I honestly don't even want to see something like that. The idea of living in an anarchist society, one without government, I think is very, very dangerous. If we want to see what anarchy looks like, look at Syria. Syria is not a very nice place to be. However oppressive that government was, I think most people, if given a choice between being in Syria 3 years ago and being in Syria now, would choose to be there 3 years ago, unless they happen to be revolutionaries. Most people are not. Most people want to have an easy life, and life in Syria, or much of Syria, is unfortunately certainly not easy for those poor people living in that country. So in any event, that's basically what I think Mills is talking about. He's saying that the people who occupy this power elite have this class consciousness. They are aware of what is beneficial to them. On the other hand, the people on the bottom, the masses of humanity, everyone else, does not have that kind of awareness. Now, in framing or discussing the power elite, Mills said that it consists of 3 major sections of society. The first he defined as the Fortune 500 companies. Every year, Fortune magazine makes a list of the wealthiest corporations in the United States. So these would be the top 500 of them. That's the first. The second is the Department of Defense, the top military brass working at the Pentagon primarily. The third, the executive branch of government. Mills was here, I think, primarily referring to the President and the President's cabinet, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and so forth. So, according to Mills, that was the power elite. Now, other people, in particular Ralph Domhoff, have come along and have attempted to modify that power elite model, have added additional things to it. Other people, even more recently, have changed it even further. So if one wants to begin with a power elite framework, there are many different models or paradigms of that which are available. Now, I'll tell you first why I think that the power elite model is not especially useful, and then I'll move into a discussion of another aspect of this, and I'll try to keep this as coherent as I possibly can. My problem basically with the power elite model is that it focuses too much on singularity. In other words, there is a singular elite. Regardless of whether one sees them as being united or having a conspiracy or working together all the time or agreeing with each other all the time, still it's a kind of dualistic view of power. There are the haves and there are the have-nots. There are the powerful and there are the powerless. It's a very similar approach in many respects to the one that Karl Marx took in looking at the relationship between the capitalists and the workers, although even Marx was more sophisticated than that, and he talked about other classes, less known social classes as well, such as the petty bourgeoisie, the lumpen proletariat, and the intelligentsia, social classes which generally don't get discussed in common speech. But regardless, I think that that kind of simplistic approach, which divides society into the haves and the have-nots, or the powerful and the powerless, is much too simplistic. So in place of that, I will make a suggestion, and in doing so, I will bring together 2 different sets of ideas. The first, the concept of intersectionality, sometimes also referred to as the Matrix of Domination, and here I am referring especially to the views of Patricia Hill Collins, who was the 2009 president of the American Sociological Association. I actually use one of her textbooks in my social problems class, a book that she edited along with somebody else, but she is the primary person who is the editor of that book. And the second idea is Demi-reality. And of course I've talked about Demi-reality in previous broadcasts. Demi-reality referring to disunity. It's a concept that was developed by British philosopher Roy Bhaskar. So let me begin with the concept of intersectionality, or the Matrix of Domination. As Patricia Hill Collins uses those terms, they are very similar, if not identical, but at least very close. I'll read you a few brief excerpts from things that she has written on that subject. The first is from a book called On Intellectual Activism. I have used the thesis of intersectionality and the idea of the matrix of domination as interrelated constructs to describe social structures of domination. Intersectional thinking suggests that race, class, gender, nation, sexuality, ethnicity, age, and other forms of social hierarchy structure one another. My goal has been to conceptualize intersectionality and study its manifestations as in a matrix of domination from one social setting to the next. This next quotation, also by Collins, is from her book Fighting Words, Black Women and the Search for Justice. I introduced the term matrix of domination as a heuristic device for describing structural power relations that house individuals and groups. Finally, this is from another book she wrote called Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment. Another way of approaching power views it as not something that groups possess, but as an intangible entity that circulates within a particular matrix of domination, and to which individuals stand in varying relationships. These approaches emphasize how individual subjectivity frames human actions within a matrix of domination. Okay, let me break this thing apart. The concept of a matrix. Well, Patricia Hill Collins developed that concept long before the movie, even the first movie, The Matrix, came out. So she was not influenced by that movie. But I think a way of perhaps visualizing what is intended here by matrix is something like a web or a cage or some kind of framework, a jail cell maybe would be a good example. One article in the book that I use actually uses the metaphor of the birdcage. It was not written by her, but she did include it in the book, and I think the birdcage metaphor is very useful. In other words, say you have a woman, and this woman works in a company, and in this company she is subjected to discrimination as a woman. Maybe employment discrimination. She's not being promoted as rapidly as her male colleagues. Perhaps she's being subjected to certain levels of sexual harassment. But on the other hand, the same woman, let's say a white woman, goes home, and she happens to live in a relatively affluent neighborhood. Although she herself does not make much money, her husband does. And so her and her husband find out that there are plans to build a low-income housing development, or as we used to call them in New York City, tenements, and she becomes outraged. How dare they? It will lower the property values. It will increase the crime rate. Very common complaints that white people make when minorities are about to move into their area. Complaints which are still made today. So in the first example, in the first status of being an employee, she is oppressed. But in the second status, she is occupying the status of an oppressor. So in other words, whether somebody has power or does not have power is not an absolute condition. It is relative to the particular social situation or social structure in which people find themselves at any given moment in time. So people may have power, and then they may not have power. Now, as I see it, the problem with that, and the reason why these inequalities exist, is because of capitalism. World capitalism, the world system of capitalism, as Emanuel Wallerstein has referred to it, is a system which creates divisions. It is a system which sets people apart from each other and makes it difficult for people to reach across the aisles and work with somebody, say somebody else who is oppressed, but maybe in a different situation. People recognize, well, I'm oppressed, but I can't quite see that other person sitting on the other side of the room who is perhaps experiencing oppression too. Well, I can't exactly experience what that other person is experiencing. I can't read somebody's mind. Oppression is not a thing, it's a word. But it is a descriptive word. To rank oppressions makes no sense. To say that one oppression is worse than another oppression is illogical, totally unsociological. Instead, you look at oppression within a particular social structure, you examine the actors and how they interrelate with each other and how they share, or in some cases, do not share power among them. And then you make a determination as to how power is distributed in that social structure. So, for that reason, I think that Collins has come very close to what I see as a good understanding of how capitalism operates. It's not that you have an absolute class of elites and an absolute class of masses. Instead, you have these different levels, these different intersections of people with varying levels of power operating in entirely different situations, sometimes at cross purposes. And so people who are experiencing oppression as a result of living in the capitalist system are not able to work with one another. And that is what Collins encourages in her work. So Collins' work is not only theoretical, although it is theoretical, meaning explanatory. She is attempting to explain why there is oppression, gender oppression, race oppression, and so forth. But it's more than that. She's attempting to go beyond that and explore the ways in which we as human beings can hopefully discover ways of becoming emancipated from that oppression in a somewhat similar but not exactly the same way that Roy Bhaskar, the founder of critical realism and the philosophy of metaReality, discusses emancipation. Now, here is a brief and relatively minor criticism of the Matrix of Domination or intersectionality. Intersectionality comes out of a school of sociological thought called social constructionism. The basic idea of social constructionism, which comes from various sources, primarily from Peter Berger and a book he wrote called The Social Construction of Reality. Later on it was influenced by the works of Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher and linguist. From a social constructionist perspective, reality is entirely socially constructed. Everything that we observe, everything that happens to us, is a construction. In other words, there is no permanent ontology or reality. There is no substructure of the real, as Bhaskar refers to it, which exists in the world. So instead, we have the option of deciding what kind of society do we want to have. Now, on one level, that's pretty empowering. If I have the ability to say, well, I don't like the way society works, I don't like the kinds of oppressions or inequalities which exist in society, therefore I am going to get together with some other people and work with them to form a more equitable society, well, that's an appealing idea. The problem with it is that, at least from my perspective, there is this lower or maybe substructure of the real. There is this reality or ontology. So pretending that there is no reality, pretending that there is no cosmic envelope, as Roy Bhaskar calls it, these unities which exist, in which we are all literally wrapped up in, is simply an illusion. And so I think the basic idea is then that when we are talking about restructuring society, we need to do so with an awareness of both demi-reality, which is disunity, and the cosmic envelope, which is unity. In other words, we need to ask, on which level of reality are we going to live? I think that the world today, for the most part, has made its decision. We see the tremendous conflicts in the world, whether in Syria, or Iran, or Pakistan, or North Korea, or Israel, and so forth. Throughout Europe, the EU seems to be on the brink of collapse, or at least perhaps reorganization. And so the question is, well, what do we do? Do we simply decide to restructure it in a new way? Or do we ask the question, how can we align our world better with this substructure of the cosmic envelope? And I think that is the thing that we need to do. So social constructionism, which is a non-ontological or non-metaphysical approach to looking at society and social groups, is interesting, but it ignores the underlying reality which dictates who we are and what we do. Until next time, this is Dr. Mark Foster. Have a good one.